Imagine hearing a faint scratch at your door in the dead of winter. You expect wind, maybe a stray branch, but when Sarah opened her door, she found something no one could ever prepare for. A massive grizzly bear, frostbitten, injured, and desperate for help. Most would have slammed the door shut, but what Sarah did next would change her life forever. What unfolded is a story of courage, compassion, and an unbreakable bond between a woman and a creature of the wild. Stay with us because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. The Alaskan wilderness was not for the faint of heart. Endless snow stretched out as far as Sarah Jensen could see, covering the towering pines and frozen lakes like a heavy white blanket. She had lived in her small wooden cabin on the outskirts of Fairbanks for nearly 2 years, ever since the tragic loss of her husband Tom. The silence, once suffocating, had become a strange kind of comfort, a place to bury her grief away from the bustling city and sympathetic looks. That night, the wind howled like a restless spirit outside, rattling the windows and making the wooden beams creak. Sarah sat in her cozy living room, wrapped in a thick quilt, sipping hot tea by the crackling fireplace. She was reading an old novel when it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible sound echoed from the front porch. Scratch. Thump. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind, maybe a loose shutter flapping in the storm, but then it came again, louder this time, a deliberate, desperate sound. Her heart raced. Who or what could be out there in the middle of a blizzard? Grabbing her flashlight and sliding into her thick wool slippers, she cautiously approached the door. She peered through the frosted glass window, but saw nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Her breath fogged up the glass, making it even harder to see. Against her better judgment, Sarah slowly unlatched the door, her fingers trembling. She cracked it open just an inch, the icy wind immediately biting at her skin. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Standing, or rather slumping on her porch, was a massive grizzly bear, but this wasn't the fierce predator she had always imagined. Its fur was matted with ice, its body trembling from the cold. A deep, angry gash stretched across its side, dark blood staining the snow beneath it. The bear's eyes, instead of wild and aggressive, were glazed with pain and exhaustion. They met Sarah's, and in that instant, something passed between them. A silent plea for help. Sarah's mind screamed at her to slam the door shut to protect herself from this wild beast. But her heart whispered something different. She saw not a monster, but a creature on the brink of death, desperate for warmth and safety. She stood frozen, torn between fear and compassion. Then, without fully understanding why, Sarah made the most shocking decision of her life. She stepped aside, and the grizzly bear, limping, bleeding, and half-frozen, staggered through the doorway into her home. The door clicked shut behind the bear with a finality that echoed in Sarah's chest. She stood in stunned silence, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the howl of the storm outside. The heat from the fireplace clashed with the icy draft that clung to the massive creature now standing in the middle of her living room. The bear's breath came in ragged puffs visible in the warm air, and its legs trembled under its weight. It looked around the small cabin with slow, deliberate movements, its dark eyes flickering from the crackling fire to Sarah's rigid figure. For a moment, Sarah feared it might lash out, driven by pain or confusion, but the bear didn't move aggressively. Instead, it collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud, as though the last ounce of its strength had finally given out. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, to lock herself in the bedroom, maybe even escape through the back door. But something in the bear's posture, its labored breathing and the blood seeping onto her floor, held her in place. It wasn't a threat. It was a creature teetering on the edge of life. She took a shaky step forward, her eyes fixed on the deep gash along the bear's side. It was a nasty wound, likely from a hunter's trap or a fight with another animal. Either way, if she didn't act quickly, the bear would bleed out. "What am I doing?" she thought, but her feet moved anyway. Sarah shuffled to the kitchen, keeping one eye on the bear as she rummaged through the drawers. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a first aid kit, a clean towel, and a bowl of warm water. As she approached, the bear's head lifted slightly, its eyes locking onto hers with a flicker of awareness. She stopped, her heart leaping into her throat. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." She wasn't sure if it was the tone of her voice or the bear's sheer exhaustion, but it lowered its head again, letting out a low, rumbling sigh. Taking that as permission, Sarah knelt cautiously beside it, her hands hovering just above its fur. Up close, the bear was even more massive than she'd realized. Its fur was coarse and thick, matted with ice and blood. The wound was deep, but it didn't seem to have hit any vital organs. The bear flinched at the contact, a guttural growl rumbling from its chest. Sarah froze, her breath caught mid-air. But then, as if understanding she meant no harm, the bear relaxed again, allowing her to continue. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah cleaned the wound, her movements careful and deliberate. The bear's breathing slowed and its eyes fluttered closed, either from exhaustion or trust, maybe both. By the time she finished, Sarah was covered in sweat despite the chill in the air. She sat back on her heels, staring at the sleeping giant sprawled across her living room floor. The firelight danced across its fur, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "What have I done?" she wondered. But as she watched the bear's chest rise and fall in steady rhythm, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She had saved a life tonight, one she never expected to touch, let alone invite into her home. For the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel alone. The first rays of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale golden glow across the cabin. Sarah awoke with a jolt, momentarily disoriented. She had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fireplace, her body stiff from the awkward position. But it wasn't the ache in her muscles that sent a shiver down. Her spine. It was the realization of what had happened the night before. Slowly, she turned her head toward the center of the room. The bear was still there. It lay exactly where it had collapsed, its massive body stretched out on the wooden floor. The blood-stained towel she had pressed against its wound was now dark and crusted, but the bear's breathing was steady, its chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting soft shadows that danced across the room. For a moment, Sarah wondered if it had all been a dream, but the faint scent of wet fur and iron in the air was all too real. She stood up carefully, her joints protesting after a night of restless sleep. Every movement was cautious, as if afraid to wake the beast too soon. She crept into the kitchen, her eyes never leaving the bear, and started boiling water. The clinking of the kettle felt unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent room. As she prepared some herbal tea for herself, Sarah's thoughts swirled with questions. What happens now? She had saved the bear, but was it safe to keep it here? Should she call wildlife authorities? And more importantly, would it even survive the next few days? She didn't have answers, but deep down she felt something she couldn't quite explain. A strange connection, as if their lives had been woven together in that moment of desperation at the door. The bear stirred. Sarah froze, the steaming mug halfway to her lips. The bear's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the soft morning light. Its gaze met hers, and for a heartbeat, time stood still. There was no aggression in its eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her voice soft but steady. "Hey there," she whispered as if speaking to an old friend. "You're safe." The bear didn't move, but its breathing quickened slightly as if recognizing her voice. Sarah set her mug down and approached with slow, deliberate steps. She knelt beside the bear again, inspecting the wound. The bleeding had stopped, but the area was swollen and raw. "I need to clean this up," she murmured, gathering fresh towels and antiseptic. The bear tensed as she dabbed the wound, a low rumble vibrating in its chest, but it didn't lash out. Instead, it seemed to relax under her careful touch, its massive head resting heavily on the floor. Hours passed as Sarah tended to the bear, speaking to it in hushed tones, as if her words could soothe the pain. She told it about Tom, about the loneliness that had settled in her heart like the snow outside. It felt strange, confiding in a creature that couldn't understand her words, but somehow it felt right. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Sarah realized something remarkable. The bear wasn't just surviving, it was healing. The days that followed blurred into a surreal routine. Sarah never imagined she'd be sharing her home with a grizzly bear. Yet, here they were, two lost souls under the same roof, navigating an unspoken understanding. The bear, which she had begun calling Kodiak after the Alaskan island known for its grizzlies, never showed aggression. Instead, it watched her with those deep, soulful eyes, as if it understood the delicate balance between trust and fear. Each morning, Sarah woke to the sight of Kodiak curled near the dying embers of the fireplace. The wound on his side was healing, though slowly, and his strength began to return. He moved with more ease, his massive paws thudding softly against the wooden floor as he shifted positions. Sarah adapted too, leaving bowls of water near him, rationing her food to share scraps of fish and berries. But the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't sustainable. Kodiak was a wild animal, no matter how gentle he seemed, and the longer he stayed, the more dangerous it could become for both of them. One morning, as Sarah sipped her tea, she watched Kodiak stir from his makeshift bed by the fire. He stretched his massive frame, his muscles rippling beneath his thick fur. The sight was both majestic and terrifying. Sarah knew she couldn't keep him here forever. The wilderness was his home. But the thought of letting him go stirred an unexpected ache in her chest. She stood and approached him cautiously, her heart pounding. "You can't stay here forever, you know," she whispered, kneeling beside him. Her fingers brushed against his fur, feeling the warmth beneath the coarse hair. "You belong out there." Kodiak's eyes met hers, and for a moment Sarah swore he understood. But when she opened the door to let in the crisp, cold air, Kodiak didn't move. He stared at the open doorway, then back at Sarah, his gaze heavy with something that felt like reluctance. Sarah sighed, closing the door again. Maybe not today, she thought, but the decision would soon be out of her hands. That afternoon, Sarah ventured outside for the first time in days to gather firewood. The snow was knee-deep, and the cold bit at her cheeks as she trudged through the drifts. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with unseen eyes. As she stacked the wood near the porch, a noise caught her attention. A distant rustle followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting visitors. Then she saw them. Two figures emerging from the treeing, their bright orange vests standing out starkly against the white landscape. Hunters. Panic surged through her veins. She glanced back at the cabin where Kodiak was resting, oblivious to the approaching danger. If they saw him, they'd assume he was a threat, and they wouldn't hesitate. Sarah dropped the firewood and sprinted back inside, slamming the door behind her. Kodiak lifted his head, sensing her distress. "They're here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Hunters?" She didn't know what to do. She couldn't hide a grizzly bear in her tiny cabin, and she couldn't risk the hunters discovering him. But before she could form a plan, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and opened the door just a crack. A man in his 50s, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes, stood on her porch. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his breath puffed out in clouds. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted, his voice gruff. "We're tracking a bear. Big one, dangerous. Seen anything?" Sarah forced a smile, her mind racing. "No, haven't seen a thing," she lied. "Just me in the snow out here." The man studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he nodded. "All right, but be careful. Bears this time of year are desperate. You don't want to be caught off guard." "I'll keep that in mind," Sarah replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Kodiak watched her from across the room, his dark eyes filled with quiet understanding. Sarah knew then that their time was running out. She had to make a choice, one that could mean life or death. The hunter's visit left Sarah restless. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, she sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. Kodiak lay nearby, his breathing steady, but there was a tension in the air neither of them could ignore. She knew it was only a matter of time before the hunters returned, and when they did, they wouldn't be satisfied with a polite dismissal. Sarah's mind swirled with impossible questions. Could she protect Kodiak? Should she even try? Was it foolish to risk everything for a wild animal? But when she looked into his deep, soulful eyes, the answer felt simple. She had to try. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn. The sky was a pale gray, and the air was thick with the promise of another snowstorm. She quietly packed a small bag with supplies, bandages, dried food, and her father's old hunting knife, though she doubted it would be much use. Kodiak stirred as she moved around the cabin, his eyes following her every step. When she knelt beside him, he let out a soft rumble as if sensing her unease. "We need to go," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his massive shoulder. "They'll come back, and if they find you here—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Kodiak seemed to understand. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow but strong. The wound on his side had closed, though he still limped slightly. Together, they stepped out into the bitter cold, leaving behind the warmth of the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet as they trekked deeper into the wilderness. The snow crunched beneath Sarah's boots and Kodiak's heavy paws, their breath visible in the icy air. Sarah led the way, following a path she knew would take them far from the hunters' usual trails. Her heart pounded in her chest, but with every step a strange sense of determination settled over her. They walked for hours, the landscape shifting from dense woods to open snow-covered plains. Sarah's muscles ached and her fingers were numb despite the thick gloves. Kodiak pressed on, his strength returning with each mile. But just as they reached the edge of a frozen river, Sarah heard it, the distant echo of voices, the hunters. Panic surged through her. She glanced at Kodiak, who had also heard the approaching danger. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "We have to cross," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to the frozen river. The ice looked thin, but there was no other choice. If they stayed, the hunters would find them. And this time, there'd be no talking their way out. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the ice. It groaned under her weight, sending shivers down her spine. She moved carefully, testing each step before committing her full weight. Kodiak followed, his massive paws spreading out to distribute his weight. Halfway across, Sarah heard it. A sharp crack. She froze. "Kodiak!" she whispered, glancing back at the bear. But it was too late. The ice beneath him gave way with a deafening roar, and he plunged into the freezing water. "No!" Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees and scrambling toward the hole. The freezing water lapped at the edges, and Kodiak's massive head broke the surface, his eyes wide with panic. He clawed at the ice, trying to pull himself up, but the edges kept breaking under his weight. Without thinking, Sarah crawled closer, reaching out her hand. "Hold on," she cried, though she knew he couldn't understand her words, but he understood the urgency in her voice. Using every ounce of strength, Sarah grabbed a fallen branch and extended it toward Kodiak. The bear latched onto it with his powerful jaws, and Sarah pulled with all her might. Her muscles screamed in protest, her vision blurred with tears and cold, but she didn't stop. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Kodiak dragged himself out of the water, collapsing onto the ice beside her. Sarah sobbed with relief, wrapping her arms around his wet fur despite the freezing cold. They had made it, but as the sound of the hunters' voices grew louder, Sarah knew the danger wasn't over. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling from the cold and exertion. Kodiak lay beside her on the brittle ice, his fur soaked and steaming in the freezing air, but they had no time to recover. The hunters' voices were growing louder, closer, echoing through the trees like the distant growl of an approaching storm. She had to act. "Kodiak!" she whispered, shaking his massive shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, filled with exhaustion, but also something else. Trust. He trusted her, and she couldn't let him down. Summoning strength she didn't know she had, Sarah pulled herself to her feet, her boots slipping on the ice. She grabbed the bear's fur and coaxed him up. He groaned but obeyed, staggering to his feet, his powerful body trembling with cold and fatigue. They stumbled off the ice and into the cover of the dense forest, moving as quickly as their battered bodies allowed. The snow was deeper here, muffling their footsteps, but it also slowed them down. Sarah's lungs burned, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she pushed on, driven by sheer determination. Then came the sound she dreaded, the sharp crack of a rifle shot. It echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable shout of one of the hunters. They had spotted them. Panic surged through Sarah's veins like fire. She turned to Kodiak, whose ears had perked up at the sound. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. "This is it! They couldn't outrun the hunters!" Not like this. But maybe they didn't have to. Sarah led Kodiak to a narrow ravine, its steep walls offering some semblance of cover. She crouched behind a fallen tree, pulling the bear down with her. The snow was cold against her skin, but her heart pounded so hard she barely felt it. The hunters' voices grew louder, their footsteps crunching through the snow. Sarah peeked over the log, her breath catching in her throat. There were 3 of them now, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces set with determination. "They went this way," one of them shouted, pointing toward the ravine. Sarah's mind raced. She had to think of something, anything, to protect Kodiak. Then it hit her. She remembered the old flare gun tucked away in the emergency kit back at the cabin. She had brought it just in case. Her fingers fumbled through her bag, finding the cold metal cylinder at the bottom. It was her last chance. As the hunters approached, Sarah took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. She aimed the flare gun toward the sky and pulled the trigger. A bright red flare shot into the air with a loud whoosh, illuminating the forest like a second sun. The hunters froze, shielding their eyes from the sudden burst of light. And that's when Kodiak moved with a roar that shook the trees. He leapt over the fallen log, his massive body crashing into the snow. The hunters stumbled back, their rifles raised, but the flare had done its job. It disoriented them just long enough for Sarah to act. "Run, Kodiak," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. The bear hesitated for a split second, his eyes flicking back to Sarah. Then, with a powerful leap, he disappeared into the forest. Sarah stayed behind, her heart pounding as the hunters regained their senses. They pointed their rifles at her, their eyes wide with confusion and anger. "Where's the bear?" one of them demanded. Sarah stood tall, her fear replaced by something fiercer, defiance. "Gone," she said, her voice steady, "and you're not going to find him." For a moment, the hunters just stared at her as if trying to decide whether she was bluffing. But the flare's smoke was still thick in the air, and the bear's tracks were already disappearing under the falling snow. Finally, the leader of the group lowered his rifle, muttering a curse under his breath. "Let's go," he snapped. "It's not worth it." And just like that, they turned and disappeared into the woods. Sarah sank to her knees, the adrenaline draining from her body. She had done it. Kodiak was safe. But as she sat there in the snow, a new ache settled in her chest. She had let him go. The forest had never felt so quiet. Sarah sat alone in the snow for what felt like hours, staring at the place where Kodiak had disappeared into the trees. The adrenaline that had carried her through the escape faded, leaving behind an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. She should have felt relief. Relief that the hunters were gone. Relief that Kodiak was safe. But instead, a strange, aching sadness settled in her chest. She had known from the moment she opened that door that their time together was temporary. Kodiak was a creature of the wild, and she was just a woman searching for meaning in a world that had taken too much from her. But knowing it didn't make letting.